Shvi'is Perek Zayin Mishnah Aleph. Klal Gadol Amr B'Shvi'is. The Chachamim stated a major rule about Shemitah. We've learned that the produce of Shemitah has Kedusha, which requires it to be treated in a special way. It must be eaten or consumed in a food-like manner and may not be wasted or used for business purposes. The Torah says, "V'hoisa Shabbos ha'aretz lechem la'ochla," the uncultivated produce of the land shall be for you to eat. The pasuk teaches that Shemitah produce may be used only for eating and other similar activities. It must be left for all to take, it must be hefker, and it may not be guarded by the owner of the field in which it grew. Additionally, most Shemitah produce requires beer. The process of beer is performed when each species of that produce is no longer available in the field for wild animals to eat. At that point, a person who has any of the species in his house must give up his rights of ownership in it and put it outside his house for anyone to take. However, not everything that has Kedusha Shvi'is is mechuyev in beer. This Mishnah deals with the produce that has Shemitah and requires beer, and the next Mishnah is going to speak of produce that has Shemitah, that has Kedusha Shvi'is, but does not require beer. Kol shu meichel odom u'meichel behema miminat tzayvim, any produce that is food for people or food for animals or a species used for dyeing, ve'ena miskayim ba'aretz, and does not last on the ground, it rots if it's left on the ground for a long time. The Mefarshim discuss the definition of does not last in the ground, of eina miskayim ba'aretz. According to one shita, it means that the species rots on the ground before the end of the 8th year. This condition is not required for produce to have Kedusha Shvi'is. It is listed here only because of its relevance to the halacha of beer. When a species is no longer available in the field for an animal to eat, one must perform beer with it. Therefore, a species that lasts in the ground for a long time is patur from beer, since it's available for animals for so long. Beer is needed only for types of produce that do not last in the ground. Yesh le shvi'is v'dama shvi'is. It has Kedusha Shvi'is, and if it's sold, the money received has Kedusha Shvi'is on it as well. Produce that people eat has Kedusha Shvi'is, as it's clear from the pasuk that the uncultivated produce of the land shall be for you to eat. Produce that animals eat is also kaddish, as says the next pasuk, it should be lechem l'chaya v'l'hem t'chav l'chaya shabartzecha. And here called for aschalecha. The Chamim learned from the pasuk that Shemitah sanctity applies even to the produce that's used only for activities that merely resemble eating. When one eats, the food is destroyed at the same time that it provides benefit. Therefore, any plants that share this characteristic are treated like food and have Kedusha Shvi'is. Included in this category are items that are used for dyeing, because the dye stuff is consumed at the same time that it colors the fabric. So Yesh le Shvi'is l'dama Shvi'is, and the money also has Kedusha Shvi'is. For example, if a person sells Shemitah produce when one is allowed to, the money he gets from the sale becomes kaddish, just like the produce itself. Therefore, as is the case with Shemitah produce, he may not waste the money or use it for business purposes. Instead, he must use it to buy food, and the kedusha of the money is thereby transferred to the purchased food. Yesh le beer uludam of beer. It's subject to the requirement of beer, because it eventually rots and becomes unavailable for wild animals to eat. And if it's sold, the money receives it for it is subject to the requirements of beer. For example, if he sold pomegranates, the money he receives is subject to beer, just like the pomegranates. When pomegranates are no longer found on the trees in the field, any money that remains from the sale must be removed from the house. Ve'ezeh, and which types of produce are examples of these things? The Mishnah discusses each of the 3 categories it just listed: food for people that doesn't last in the ground, food for animals that don't last in the ground, and species used for dyeing that does not last in the ground. It starts by teaching that certain plants are considered food for humans, even though people rarely eat them. Ve'ezeh, and which types of produce are examples of these things? Ze'aleh haluf hashoite. The first category of human food that does not last on the ground includes the leaf of the wild leaf of luf, which, though bitter, can be eaten by being sweetened. The wild luf mentioned in our Mishnah is an inferior variety of luf that was not deliberately grown by people because its leaves are bitter. Instead, it grows wild. The Mishnah teaches that even though the leaf of this variety of luf is not edible until sweetened, it's considered a food and therefore has Kedusha Shvi'is. Va'alei hadandana, the leaf of mint, ve'ulshin v'hakreshin, endives and leeks that are wild, which are eaten when the garden varieties are unavailable. Both endives and leeks are found in 2 varieties, the commonly grown garden variety and a wild variety. In ordinary non-Shemitah years, when the garden varieties are readily available, the wild types are not eaten at all, and are therefore not considered food. During Shemitah, however, when planting is forbidden and the garden varieties cannot be found, the wild varieties are used instead, thus even they have Kedusha Shvi'is. V'haragila. Regila is purslane, a type of herb with edible leaves. Purslane is P-U-R-S-L-A-N-E. v'neitz hacholov, and the milky blossom. This is a plant with flowers as white as milk. Even though these are not frequently eaten, they're eaten often enough to be considered food, so they have kedusha shvius. Now the Mishnah moves on to examples of the second and third categories, those of animal food and dye materials. Plants used for animal food that do not last on the ground include soft thorns and thistles. This refers to soft thorns and thistles that are fit for animal consumption. Although they are an inferior food, even for animals, the Mishnah teaches that they are considered animal foods with regard to kedusha shvius. Umimin hatzayvim sviche istis v'koitza. Species used for making dye that do not last on the ground include aftergrowths of istis and safflower. Istis is a source of blue dye. The Mishnah refers to this plant as the sviche istis because if the root is left on the ground after the plant is cut, the same root produces new plants. Thus, the new plants are not the result of planting, but grew on their own, similar to svichin, which are aftergrowths. Yesh lahem shvius u'ledmeyan shvius. All these products have kedusha shvius, and the money received from them has kedusha shvius. Yesh lahem beer u'ledmeyan beer. They are subject to the requirement of beer, and the money received from them is subject to the chiyuv of beer as well. The Mishnah repeats this halacha to make a parallel with the next Mishnah, where the rule needs to be restated, as will be explained there. Mishnah base. The Chacham stated another rule. Any produce that is food for people or for animals or used for dyeing, and lasts in the ground, and it remains viable through the 8th year. It has kedusha shvius, and the money that you received for it also has kedusha shvius. Ein le beer ve'ein le dama beer. However, it's not mechuyev in beer, and the money that you received for it is not subject to hilchas beer as well. Ezehu, which types of produce are examples of these? Ikar haluf hashaita. The category of plants used for human food that last in the ground included the root of the wild luf, whereas in the previous Mishnah taught that the leaves of the wild luf do not last in the ground and are therefore subject to the laws of beer. This Mishnah teaches that the roots do survive in the ground and thus do not require beer. The ikar hanadana, and the root of the mint, of akarvanan. Akarvanan is a grass that grows near the base of a palm tree and curls itself around them. Of a chalbitin, roots in a milky blossom. These are the roots of the plant known as neitz hacholov, which is mentioned in the previous Mishnah. Vahabuchriya. The Rab defines this as a plant known in Arabic as changar. The Ma'aseh Ha'aruch describes it as a herb which root has a pleasant cinnamon-like aroma. Umimin hatzayvim hapua v'harichba. And the category of species used for dyeing that last on the ground include madder and dyer's weed. Yesh lahem shvius u'ledmeyan shvius. All these products have Shemitah sanctity, and the money received for them also has kedusha shvius. Ein lahem beer v'ledmeyan beer. However, they are not subject to the chiyuv of beer, and the money received for them is not subject to beer either. The Mishnah repeats his ruling in order to introduce Rameir's opposing opinion. Rameir says the Me'am is bar at Rosh Hashanah. Even though the plants themselves do not require beer, the money received for them must be consumed, meaning spent on food before Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year, that is before the end of Shemitah. Rameir holds that the money must be disposed of before Rosh Hashanah, because if it's left around any longer, one might forget that it has Shemitah, and it's kedusha shvius, and use it for business purposes. The money should be spent in accordance to Hilchos Shemitah before the end of the year. Once Rosh Hashanah has passed, it must be destroyed as soon as possible to prevent people from using it unlawfully. Amr later, Chacham answered him, Lehem ein beer kal v'charm ledmeim. These plants themselves are not subject to beer. How much more so for the money received for them? It's illogical to treat the exchange money, whose kedusha shvius comes from the original Shemitah produce, more strictly than the produce itself. Therefore, since the Shemitah produce itself has no beer and certainly does not have to be destroyed, the money exchanged for it need not be destroyed either. The Chachamim agree that Rameir's concern about accidentally using the money for business purposes is valid. Nevertheless, we cannot be more stringent with the money than with the produce itself. Rameir, on the other hand, argues that the money should indeed be treated more stringently than the produce. Since the money looks the same as any other money, the owner might forget that it's kadosh and do business with it. The produce, on the other hand, is recognizable as belonging to shvius, and therefore the owner is unlikely to use it improperly. Mishnah Gimel, Klipe Rimain, the peel of a pomegranate, Zahanei Cholei, and its blossom. This refers to the greenish growth at the top of the fruit that's encircled by the crown of the pomegranate. Klipe Agoizim, as well as the husks of walnuts. This refers not to the hard shell containing the nut, but to the husk that encloses the shell as it grows on the tree, which are all usable as dyes, Vagalinin, and fruit pits that are eaten by people or animals, like olive pits, which are used to produce oil, or date pits, which are used as animal food. Galinim is the same as garinim, The Lamed and the Reish are interchanged over here. Yesh lahem shvius, uladmei shvius. The money, they have kedusha shvius, and the money also has kedusha shvius. These items also require beer. Although the actual flesh of pomegranates, walnuts, olives, and dates have kedusha shvius, the peels and pits were not, unless they were also edible or they were used in dyeing. Hatzaba teveh la'atzmai. A dyer may use Shemitah produce to dye fabrics for himself. Lo yitzba b'schar, but he may not dye fabrics for others for payment. She'ein oisen schar b'per shvius, because we may not do business with Shemitah produce, and using the dye to make money is a business activity. Conducting business with Shemitah produce is forbidden because the Torah says that it should be lachem la'achla, from which the Chachamim learned that Shemitah produce may be used only for eating and related purposes, and not for making profit. The plain act of selling produce of Shemitah is not usher unless one does so to make a profit, because the Torah asks only business activities, which generally refers to buying an item in order to resell it at a higher price. The Mishnah teaches that using Shemitah produce to dye items for payment is considered a forbidden business activity. Neither may one do business with blemished firstborn animals. Someone who has firstborn male cattle, sheep, or goats must give them to a kohen. The kohen brings the animal, which is called a bechar, as a korban in the Beis Hamikdash. Only Kahanim or members of their households may eat its meat. If the animal has a mum that disqualifies it from being offered as a korban in the Beis Hamikdash, it must still be given to a kohen, but he doesn't bring it as a korban. Instead, he may eat it wherever he wants, or let someone else eat it, or he may sell it. However, certain restrictions apply to its use. It's also begiz of avoda. It may not be worked, and its wool may not be sheared. Although the kohen may sell a bechar bal mum, the Chacham asks doing business with it, such as buying a bechar in order to resell it at a higher price. The reason for this is that if a market existed for blemished firstborn animals for a bechar bal mum, Kahanim would delay shechting them in order to sell them. The delay could result in people violating the Isurim against working and shearing these animals. V'leba trumas, nor with truma. Truma is a portion of produce of Eretz Yisrael that's set aside and given to a kohen. It's forbidden for a non-kohen to eat truma. The Chachamim prohibited doing business with truma because if it were to be stored like merchandise, there's a concern that it may be eaten by a non-kohen. V'loy ban nevelos, not with nevelos. A nevela is any dead animal, except a kosher animal that was... Yeah.
Going to the bathroom.
Okay. Except a kosher animal that was slaughtered in the required way through shechita. The Torah forbids eating the items mentioned from here until the end of the list. Nevelis, treifis, shkatzim, aramasim. As a rule, it's also to do business with the things that are forbidden to eat. This is itself a isur min Torah. However, the Torah states explicitly that one may sell a nevela to a guy. Thus, the Torah, the isur applies only to business activities such as buying an item and selling it for profit. The isur does not include selling something that one happens to own. The leba treifis. A treif is an animal that has certain types of wounds or defects that would typically cause it to die in the near future, probably within a year. The Torah says that even if it's shechted, it may not be eaten. The leba shkatzim. The category of shkatzim includes the non-kosher fish and other aquatic creatures, seahorses, frogs, etc., non-kosher birds and other flying creatures like flies, mosquitoes, and bees, and land-based vermin of various kinds, snakes and scorpions. In some contexts, such as here, this term refers to all animals that are not kosher. Ramasim are tiny worms and insects that grow inside the fruit or rotting matter. It's interesting because the Gemara Chulin says that there are certain cases in which you are allowed to eat the bugs that grow in a fruit. If the bug always lived in the fruit and never moved off the fruit, then you're allowed to eat it. But that's a separate shmooze, but that's about Ramasim. A person may not take vegetables of the field in order to sell them, and then sell them in the market, because this has the appearance of a business activity. But he may pick the vegetables and his son may sell them instead of him. Since he's not selling them himself, he doesn't seem to be engaging in business. The Torah asks buying Shemitah produce in order to resell it at a profit. Midrabanon, it's forbidden even to pick produce for the purpose of selling it, because doing so resembles business activity. The Isur Midrabanan, however, applies only where the person picking the produce sells it himself. If anyone else, even if the picker's son, sells it, there is no Isur, because this does not have a business-like appearance. Even when selling Shemitah produce is mutter, the money received for it is kadosh, as taught in the beginning of the parak. If one picked Shemitah produce for the purpose of eating it himself and left some over, he's allowed to sell it. In this case, he may even sell it himself, for since he picked the produce in order to eat it, selling what remains does not resemble a business activity. Mishnah Dalet. If someone bought a blemished firstborn animal, a bechor balmum, to shechter for his son's wedding feast, it's permitted to buy and eat a blemished firstborn animal, as mentioned in the previous Mishnah, or regel, or for a yamtiv, but then he didn't eat it. But he's allowed to sell it since he didn't buy it in order to do business with it. Even in this case, however, he must sell it at the original price. He's forbidden to make profit from its sale. If trappers of wild animals, fowl, or fish happen to come across non-kosher species, they were trying to trap kosher species, but non-kosher species got caught in their traps or nets, they're allowed to sell them. Since the non-kosher creatures enter the traps or nets by accident, and the trapper did not go out of his way to obtain them, selling them is not considered a business activity that would be forbidden in a Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, af mishan zmana le'lefi darkoi, lekeach u'meicher. The previous Tana specified trappers, which refer to people who earn their livelihood by trapping animals. In his opinion, according to the Tanna Kama, only they are allowed to sell non-kosher species that they happen to catch, but other people are usher from doing this. And the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda is going to be chaylik. Although in Torah, the Torah does allow someone to sell non-kosher animals that he trapped by chance, the Chachamim assered selling it. The ruling of the first time is a special kula that the Chachamim granted to professional trappers because they had to pay heavy taxes to the government for the animals that they caught, which they could not afford unless they were allowed to sell any animal, kosher or non-kosher, that happened to come their way. This kula does not apply to ordinary people who do not have to pay these taxes. Therefore, if someone who is not a professional trapper happens to catch a non-kosher species, he may not sell it. Rabbi Yehuda says, even someone who is not a professional trapper who chanced upon a non-kosher animal, may take it and sell it, as long as this does not become his practice. Rabbi Yehuda holds that rabbinic law does not forbid selling non-kosher animals that were obtained by chance. Thus, anyone, whether he's a professional trapper or not, who happens to find a non-kosher animal may take it and sell it. That is, although Rabbi Yehuda permits a person to sell a non-kosher animal that he finds by chance, he may not make it his practice to seek out such finds. The Chachamim forbid someone who is not a professional trapper to sell a non-kosher animal, even if he chanced upon it. This brings to mind the famous tshuva of Rabbi Yehuda about going hunting, where he says that the problem with hunting is that it's einem yishuv shalaylam, and besides for other problems, but that's the main problem. Over here is a person making his umnis out of selling dvar ma'asurim. He shouldn't do that. The Mishnah returns to the previous discussion. Mishnah Hey. The Mishnah returns to his previous discussion about which items of Shemitah produce are subject to beer. We have learned that since beer is required for produce only when its species becomes unavailable in the field for wild animals to eat, beer is not required for plants that endure in the ground, which are available to the animals for a long time. The Mishnah applies this rule to the shoots of trees. Shoots are the soft growths that sprout at the end of the branches when the trees blossom. So Lulbeis Radam Echaruv, the shoots of the service tree and the carob tree, Yesh Lam Shviz have Kedusha Shviz because they're edible to humans. Ulad Meyan Shviz, and the money exchanged for them has Kedusha Shviz. Yesh Lam beer, they're subject to beer because they wither and fall to the tree and become unfit to be eaten even by wild animals. Doesn't mean chaya wild as opposed to domesticated, it just means the animal in the field. Ulad Meyan beer, and the money exchanged for them is Mechuyev beer also. Lulve ha'olah v'habotna v'atodin, the shoots of the terebinth, the pistachio tree, and the thorn bush. I guess atodin is a thorn bush, Gerin ha'otod, maybe it's also a thorn bush. It's interesting, the botna, the Rav says pastak. I guess pastak is pistachio. Yesh lahem shvius, have kedusha shvius, uldmein shvius, and the money exchanged for them has shmita, also has kedusha shvius also. Ein lahem beer, but they're not subject to beer because they remain on the tree. The shoots of these plants do not wither and fall off, rather they harden into branches and remain on the tree. Since the shoots are still alive and growing, the species is not subject to beer. V'le'uldmein beer, and the money exchanged for them is not subject to beer either. Aval la'olin yesh beer. However, the leaves of all these trees are subject to beer because they wither and fall off their branches and become unfit to be eaten even by wild animals. Unlike the shoots of the Elah, Botn, and Atadin, which are exempt from beer because they harden and remain on the tree, these leaves do require beer because they wither and fall off. because they're full of their branches and become unfit to be eaten even by wild animals. Mishnah Vav. Havered v'hakoifer v'haktaf v'haloitem. The rose, the clove, the sap of the balsam tree, and the stone pine. Taf is, as we say it in the Ketores. So yesh lam shvius, we have shmita, they have kedusha shvius, because they're sometimes used to flavor foods. Cloves flavor foods. The main purpose of all these items is perfume. However, they are sometimes used to flavor food, which suffices for them to be considered food with regard to kedusha shvius. So yesh lam shvius, l'dmein shvius, and the money exchanged for them has kedusha shvius. Although this is not mentioned in the Mishnah, these plants also require beer. Reb Shimon Eimer ein la k'tav shvius. Ktaf does not have kedusha shvius b'nei she'enei pri, because it's not a fruit. Rather, it's part of a tree from which it came. Although the sap of balsam is sometimes used to flavor food, Reb Shimon holds that since it's not a fruit but only a secretion of the branch, it has the halachic status of a branch. Branches themselves do not have kedusha shvius, because in order to have kedusha shvius, an item must be used in such a way that it is destroyed at the same time that it provides benefit, similar to the process of eating. This is not the case with branches, because they are commonly used as firewood, and benefit from the heat of a fire is derived after the wood has been consumed and converted into charcoal. It's not at the same time, so it's a different halacha. Mishnah Zayin. Vered chodosh shekavshe b'shemen yashan. If beer is not performed with Shemitah produce when the time of its beer deadline arrives, when that species is no longer available to wild animals in the field, it becomes asur forever and must be destroyed. The Mishnah discusses how this isur applies to a mixture of Shemitah and non-Shemitah produce. Vered chodosh shekavshe b'shemen yashan. If a 7th-year rose was soaked in old 6th-year oil, and the rose gave flavor to the oil, when the food is soaked in liquid for at least 24 hours, it's assumed to have imparted some flavor to the liquid. Thus, if the food is asur, it makes the liquid asur as well. Yelaket as havered, one may pick out the rose from the oil before the rose's beer deadline, and the 6th-year oil will remain mutter. Since the rose was removed before its deadline, when it was still mutter, the flavor is imparted to the oil. The flavor imparted to the oil was not asur. The oil therefore never became asur. The oil remains mutter even after the rose passes the beer deadline, although the rose becomes prohibited at that point and must be destroyed unless the mitzvah of beer is performed with it. It was still permitted when it was giving flavor to the oil. Since the flavor came from a permitted source, it did not make the oil asur. This is true with respect to the isur of beer, which does not take effect before the beer deadline. The halacha is different regarding kedusha shvius, which is in effect from when the produce grows or is picked. The rose already had kedusha shvius when it was being soaked in the oil. Therefore, as a rose imparted flavor to the oil, it gave the oil kedusha shvius. The oil keeps that kedusha even after the rose is removed. If an old rose, a 7th-year rose that had passed its beer deadline, was soaked in a new 8th-year oil and gave it flavor, the oil becomes subject to the hilchas beer and must therefore be destroyed. In this case, the oil absorbed flavor from the rose when the rose was already asur, for its beer deadline has passed, and the beer was not performed with it. Thus, even after the rose was removed, the oil remains forbidden because of the rose's flavor that it contained. Cheruvim chadashim shekavshem b'yayin yashan. Whether new over here means Shemitah.
Knock, knock.
Come in. What's going on?
Look what I have.
1 second.
There.
When the new 7th-year buxers were soaked in old 6th-year wine until past the buxer's beer deadline, or old carobs, meaning from the 7th year, already past their beer deadline, were soaked in new 8th-year wine, the wine is subject to beer and must be destroyed, since in each of these cases it absorbed flavor from the buxer after the carobs were already forbidden. The first of these two cases, in which the Shemitah carobs were put in permitted wine before the carob's beer deadline, is parallel to the Mishnah's previous case, where Shemitah rose was put in permitted oil before the rose's beer deadline. The Mishnah ruled above that if the rose was removed from the oil before the deadline, the oil remains permitted. Thus, the same applies here. If the carobs would have been removed from the wine before the deadline, the wine would have remained permitted. Zahaklal. This is the rule. Yeah? This is the rule. Kol shu b'naisin tam, whatever is given flavor by something that is already mechuyev in beer, so it gave it the flavor already. So chayv lavar. It itself is subject to beer. Min b'she'einay minay. If it's a mixture of a different kind, the item that absorbed the flavor is of a different type than the item that gave the flavor, as in the examples given above, where a rose was soaked in oil or carobs were soaked in wine. That is when forbidden, meaning in the post-beer deadline, produce is mixed with permitted produce of a different type. The permitted produce does not become forbidden unless it absorbs flavor from the forbidden produce. If the produce that was mutter does not absorb the flavor of the isser, it remains mutter. If two items are mixed together, and the volume of one is only 60th or less of the volume of the other, the flavor imparted by the smaller item to the larger one is too insignificant to be recognized halachically. In all of the Mishnah's previous cases, where it was assumed that the flavor was imparted, the proportion of the forbidden item to the permitted item must have been more than a 60th. If the proportion had been only a 60th or less, we would say that no flavor was imparted. Okay? Min b'mina kolshu. But if a mixture of a kind in its own kind, meaning that the taruvus was both items are the same type, then the permitted item becomes forbidden even if it contains the smallest amount of the prohibited item and did not absorb any of its flavor. For example, if a drop of Shemitah wine that passed its beer deadline fell into a large barrel of non-Shemitah wine, the entire amount is subject to the beer prohibition and must be destroyed. This chumrah applies only to the beer prohibition. Regarding other isurim, including the kedusha shvius, perish shvius, the halacha is that when a forbidden item is mixed with something else, it doesn't make the other item usher unless it's been nice and tam. Its proportion is the mixture is greater than a 60th, whether both items are the same type or different type. The isser of beer is singled out for the chumrah because the chacham is sought to punish those who neglect to fulfill the obligation of beer. Shvius iseres kol shehu b'mina. Shemitah produce that is past its beer deadline makes produce of its own kind forbidden, even if there is just the smallest amount of it in the mixture. Shalei b'mina b'nais and tam. When a Shemitah produce that's past its beer deadline is mixed with produce of a different kind, it makes the other produce forbidden only if it imparts flavor to it. The Mefarshim discuss why the Mishnah repeats this halacha. Ad kan.